Agnes, I think you're up. Agnes.
Hello and welcome. My name is Agnes Duckmo. I'm based here in the US. I'm a Scrum Master at EPAM. I've been with the company for 18 lovely months, and it's truly an honor and a privilege to be moderating this panel discussion as part of EngX Community Day. Today, we're going to be talking about an interesting topic, Agile and engineering excellence, and why we can do one without the other. But before we dive into our panel discussion, please let's watch a promotional video from the Agile Competency Center. Hello and welcome. My name is Agnes Duckmo. I'm based here in the US. I'm a Scrum Master at EPAM. I've been with the company for 18 lovely months. So it's truly an honor and a privilege to be moderating this panel discussion as part of EngX Community Day. Today, we're going to be talking about an interesting topic, Agile and engineering excellence, and why you can do one without the other. But before we dive into this interesting discussion, please let's watch a promotional video from the Agile Competency Center.
And I think we did that, Agnes. So I think we are moving forward.
I don't see anything.
No, we can't see it because it's a live feed. So we can move right into the questions. So
Okay. So we usually say agile. Usually we say agile is not a methodology. Agile is a mindset. So my first question will go to you, Sarah. And before I say that, I just want to let you know my panelists will be introducing themselves as I'm asking them questions. So Sarah, my first question goes to you. What is the Agile mindset? What does the Agile mindset look like?
Thanks, Agnes. I'm Sarah Alston. I'm an Agile coach within EPAM based out of the US, and I have been with EPAM for about 2.5 years, really focused on Agile transformations. But to answer your question, what is the Agile mindset? Basically, to sum it up, we could talk about this for a long time, but an agile mindset is really comprised of values and principles aimed at improving our ability to collaborate and pivot on priorities with low cost of change, right? So lots of times we confuse having an agile mindset with doing Scrum, right? Where Scrum is really just the framework and the process that we're following to get work done. But really that mindset is how we're thinking of ways to do things better, not just follow the same process, going through the motions, right? But being able to say to our teammates, hey, this isn't working for me. We need to do things differently. And how do we do that, right? So although we have this nice definition, right? Like, what does that actually look like in practice, right? We can't do it in isolation. We need to make sure that the team itself follows sort of the same values, the same principles, right? So when we look at the mindset, we need to make sure that we all have respect for each other within a team. We need to make sure we're collaborating together, working towards self-management and organization. The ability to change and adapt and be able to change the way we work internally, right? Not necessarily always having to ask and go get permission to make changes, but to be able to do that on your own, feel that sense of independence as a team, continuing to learn and grow as a team, change, and having pride and ownership in what you do every day, day to day, and your role within the team, right? So the agile mindset is more than just doing Scrum. It's thinking each day about those little improvements that can be made within your team to increase speed and reduce waste.
Right. And I think to add on to that, Sarah, like that's why it goes so well with technical excellence, right? So we want the team to innovate. We want them to experiment and find ways to increase quality, to automate things, etc. Like that's why you can have a team doing all the practices like you're saying, but if they're not with that mindset across the entire team, product owner, Scrum Master, even your leaders. But specifically here, we're talking about our engineers, right? Like if we want them to continue to think about how they can be agile and rather than just doing.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Michelle. Really spot on. So Michelle, this question goes to you. Why do you think the order of the manifesto included technical practices in it?
I just answered the question. Yeah, I think because it is so important that we're continuing to inspect and adapt and learning from each other, learning from our mistakes, fail fast. And so when we think about technical excellence, I think one of the definitions is uncovering better ways of developing software or whatever you're working on, hardware, infrastructure, by doing it and helping others to do it. And so when you think about the Agile Manifesto and the different principles that's in it, Principle 9 is a good example. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances delivery, right? So we want teams to always be thinking about how they can get better, improving, doing, that's why we have iterations, small chunks of work. Let's inspect and adapt. We have that feedback loop there. And so I think it's written directly in there because it's such an important aspect of Agile, of that mindset Sarah was talking about. And it's in every framework. It's kind of built into any Agile framework. Is we always need to be looking at how we can improve our technical practices, our tools, and our ways of working. So.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, Amy, if you have.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think all of us as Agile practitioners, Agile coaches, we can model, lead by example, right? So just paying attention to the details in our work, making sure we're, coaching our leaders on how to lead in that Agile environment and how that looks a little bit different. And then be experts in our technical craft as well. So knowing what frameworks to use in which situation, which other tools and techniques to use, and not just applying that one size fits all approach. Like we need to build that trust in our clients that we know what to do and what practices to do when. And then also our engineering teams, obviously, like Michelle said, right? they're the ones really focused on the technical practices and really focused on, building the thing right. And so if they're working at an unsustainable pace and they're not able to pay attention to their code quality, what I see happen all the time is then there's a ton of technical debt. And so when something needs to change, and we should be changing because it adds value to the customer, right? Not just to change and do this, sexy technology for fun, right? It's all about what are we building on behalf of that customer. But if we're not doing it using good technical practices, we're not able to make those shifts. And then a final example too is just, thinking through the accelerating rate of change, right? And how fast technology is changing and how much organizations really need to keep up to that. If you look at, for example, the Fortune 500, 50 years ago versus today, hardly any companies are remained on that list over all that time. And so it's just table stakes to do good technical practices and technical work.
Right. And I think looking at your tool stack, like, and like keeping on top of the latest tools and technologies that are out there. Yes, we don't want to jump all over, just and switch, because that costs a lot too. But doing some research and building that into your iterations, your sprints, like to do that experimenting and see where you can improve and take advantage of some of the latest technologies is a really big plus. Sarah, did I jump in? Were you gonna?
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention, because you had mentioned feedback loops and inspect and adapt, and I mentioned it as well. And so I just wanted to follow up on that real quick to say, when we're looking at this technical excellence, right, we want to make sure that we're not just looking at things when they go into production. We're not just looking at things when they're, done in development, right? That we're looking at them all the way, and we're leveraging that, maybe the Scrum framework, right, those daily stand-ups to actually inspect and adapt much more frequently than we were in the past.
Yeah, thank you so much, ladies. I could not agree more with you on that. So, Amy, I want to go back to you. Is that okay? So, why is ATDD, acceptance test delivery, acceptance test delivery development, so important for both Agile and engineering excellence?
Yeah, great question, Agnes. So acceptance test-driven development, also sometimes referred to as specification by example. So why it's so important for agility is I've just been fortunate enough to have experiences with areas that have implemented full ATDD, and it's been so amazing and impactful. The results we're going to see. Probably the most mature Agile area I worked with did this, and we started with just making sure that we had a common approach that was understood. Leadership was all in from both the business and the technical side. That was really important because it was a huge undertaking, and it's not something that I could have just come in and done by myself, right? And so we had technical people making sure that we had all of the infrastructure pieces, all of the applications that we were going to use in place. That was really key. And then once we had all of those technical tools in place, we started just going kind of team by team. And the first team that we worked with, I started training the teams and training both the product owner and the team all together on how to write their acceptance criteria differently using Gherkin, so using that given when then format. And we just started with a couple really well-defined stories, and then it expanded from there. And then later, when they were doing their full refinements, the product owner would come prepared with getting that input from our UAT folks to make sure that they were thinking through from the beginning, how is this functionality going to be tested, right? And just that whole shift left approach. So the product owner would come in with like the happy path, and then the team would work to figure out the negative scenarios and all of that. And we just, again, kind of, started slow. And then pretty soon, it was really soon, actually, it was full. Every user story that we did had automated test cases written for it. And then it made it so easy to use tools like Cucumber to do that automation. And the developers really liked it too, because they weren't making so many false assumptions about how it was going to be used. Like they knew exactly what the users were looking for and exactly how it should be written. So it just really was a huge game changer there too. We did run into some challenges though. Some of the UAT folks weren't on board. They were a little concerned that, too much of their work was going to be eliminated, had that job security fear. But we were able to work through that by just, they actually liked being involved more consistently and frequently, but just less of their time, right? Instead of all of a sudden it's time for UAT and 100% of their day was spent on UAT. They didn't have that anymore. It was just more of that constant engagement, but at a lower percentage of their time. The other big challenge we ran into too was it was a huge shift for our testers, right? So they were manual tests. We had some manual testers, and we shifted to full, the SDETs, the software development, engineer, and test. And so that was a big change as well. And again, if you didn't have that leadership support and handling, there's HR considerations for job changes and things like that, you really needed that full support. But in the end, totally worth it, right? So in a few months, we had a full regression suite built up, which was great because all of our regression had to be done manually at first. Our defect rate, we had so many releases that went defect free actually, which was great. Our manual UAT was almost completely eliminated at the end. So that was another really great key result. And then just our release frequency too, because it wasn't such a burden on the business to do a release. And so that helped. Yeah, and just the quality, I would say, was the biggest thing. So yeah, that was just one approach to where ATDD was implemented. And there was just, like I said, so many benefits and so worth it.
Yeah, I think I've seen similar examples, like at a previous organization, there was a team I was working with that had 400 defects out in production, and to manage those and prioritize them was insane. And so what they did is they moved to ATDD and automation, and I would say they dedicated a team to actually work on writing everything that existed already. And then that reduced the defects from 400 to like 5 within a 6-month period. It was unbelievable. I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it. But it was, and then from there, then forward, they went with the zero defect releases. They would not release if they had any new defects. And because of implementing ATDD and BDD across they were able to do it, and customer satisfaction up, quality up, like it's a win-win for everyone, right? So.
Perfect, Michelle. We're talking about ATDD, we're talking about BDD. Now, Michelle, I want to ask you a question. How do red-green refactor fit with inspection and adapt?
Yeah, I think it's really just that, right? It's really, it's allowing teams to create the test, and that's when they're red. Then they write production code, or they write code, and that's where it then will start to turn it to green, and then they just keep going through that cycle and refactoring. And so they clean up the mess they made in real time, like while they're developing. And so this really helps with, it's very similar to TDD or BDD, which, and I'm not sure we covered business development, driven development. And that's very similar to, just since I'm using the acronym, very similar to ATDD, where you're really doing behavior driven. So you're using the customer. It's a persona type thing. So it follows a format of, as a role, I want a feature so that benefit. And then that ties nicely into the Gherkin format for the acceptance criteria. And so that gets rid of a lot of the misunderstandings and brings that shared vocabulary to the team. So you mix like TDD, BDD, ATDD with, can I say any more acronyms? With that green refactor, and it's just the quality of your work goes up so much, and you reduce the technical debt that Amy was talking about before. The rework is so much lower. So really the cost of change and the cost of implementing both, go down. And so I think the key with red, green refactor is just knowing you do it minute by minute, right? It's not something you do at the end. You're constantly trying to refactor and make cleaner, better code, and always having a green passing test.
Thank you, Michelle. I want to go back to you, Amy. Is that okay? Why is automation so important with Agile in a complex world? I know we touched on a little bit upon it,
Sure.
but I just want to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, we only have like so much brain power that we can possibly use, right? And so when we are working on so many complex tasks, it gets just overwhelming, right? And so if we can think through like what things can we automate, what things would be great automation candidates, so we can free up some of our capacity to work on those fun puzzles that really that aren't something that that are so complex that we can't just automate them, right? And so, there's tons of techniques that we can do. One of them that I like to use with my team sometimes is value stream mapping, where maybe we have a process that isn't very well understood, but we know it's causing a lot of problems, or there's a lot of defects, or there's just so many people involved in it that it's not very end to end, it's not very well understood. So then just getting everybody in a room to say, we're gonna do a value stream map on this particular scope, or this particular, the server build process, or whatever it is, right? And just making sure that you have everybody who touches the process there. And then just making sure that everybody is honest, has an honest conversation about, what's involved, what the wait times are, what the process times are, the volumes, for example. Every value stream map I've ever worked with has, might use different measurements depending on what it is. And then really then looking at, okay, here's our current process. And then where do we see the problems, and making sure that if someone owns that part that ends up being the bottleneck or something that you want to optimize, that it's, again, blameless exercise, so that, no one has a bad feeling, and everybody goes out of it, deciding here's an automation candidate, here's something that, is either costing a lot of money, or taking a lot of time, which those two things usually go together, right? And so that's just one technique that you can use to figure out, where might we have some opportunities to automate that we might not have even known about before. Because a lot of times what we see is that, the people in the room don't have that end-to-end understanding. They know their part, but they don't really understand the entire end-to-end flow. And without that understanding, it's hard to know, maybe there's duplication that doesn't need to be happening, or, it's a great way to see where you can get better, and where you might have some automation candidates.
I also like, with moving towards automation, it really can reduce some of the cross dependencies, right, within the different teams. So if all of a sudden now this team has automated a service and they have an API, rather than having and relying on anything like, for them to do the work, now you can all of a sudden just directly call the API. And so I think there's so many ways that the automation helps, it's
automation
so
and self-service.
Yes.
Love it.
So, Michelle, as a PO of the Agile Competency Center, I have this question for you. Why doesn't architecture in the Ivory Tower work with Agile?
Thank you, Agnes. And I did realize that I never introduced myself. So hi, I'm Michelle Midbow. I am, like Agnes said, the product owner of the Agile Competency Center. I'm also a director of Agile coaching. I do a lot of client work, and absolutely love helping organizations with change. And so going back to architecture in the Ivory Tower. So for a number of years, and I won't say that many because we've really only been in the this software development type world for 50 years, but for a number of those years, we have that we think of an architect up in the Ivory Tower. He is making the decisions, but he's not part of the team. And with Agile, that mindset and where we're going, it's a different way of looking at it. it doesn't mean in Agile that there's no architect or architecture. It's just that often the role of the architect might be played by a tech lead or someone that's part of the product or the team. And we don't have these many different layers in stage gates. We wanted, rather than doing big upfront design where we spend 9 months to 2 years, which I have seen, developing a whole architecture. And by the time you get to it, then the market's already passed you and you've missed it. We do as little, just in time development or design in architecture, right? And so really just leaving the design architecture decisions to the last possible minute. And so much of the implementation of the architect will depend on the complexity of the organization and the product, obviously. So you need very technical people that understand both the business side and the IT side in that role. So it's still a very valuable role. It's just they might not be necessarily called an architect. They're doing the architect accountabilities, right? What we can see is like where they provide value is, in reusing pattern, reusing code, following standards, defining guardrails. So again, going back to the complexity of the organization and the product, that will determine what we, how we have the structure of that role and the accountabilities. So there are valuable things that the architect or the person who's accountable for the architect role does, but we don't need to have them way up in a tower that we can't even reach and get to. And so, for example, like abilities, that should be something that a team decides, what kind of reliability do you need on the site?
Michelle, a question, abilities, can you elaborate a little bit on what those are for anybody that might not know?
Yes, so abilities are like reliability, accessibility, security, even though it doesn't end in ability. So it's really those non-functional requirements that you need to have built into your product to keep the quality of your product up, your site up. Like let's say you have a accessibility that you want your site available 99.5% of the time, right? And so, or that would be availability, not accessibility. And so they're just rules and guardrails you put in place for the quality of your product and your site. So great question, Amy. We really want to have that architect person who's doing that role or accountable for those activities to think about architecting for change, the power of small, delay design decisions until absolutely necessary, architect for build, test, deploy, automation, as we talked about, DevOps practices, CI/CD, and that is too hard to do from an ivory tower. So that's why we say, let's bring the architects closer to the product, closer to the team. And there's no one right way to do it, but it's just really valuable and important with Agile to kind of break down those barriers and have more of those discussions. It's one thing that comes to mind when I think about architecture too, and how we want to model the organization is after the design of the system, and that's where architecture is so important, right? And so I think it's Conway's law that says organizing your teams after the design of the system you're working on in order to promote interoperability. So that we want product teams that are end-to-end, cross-functional, minimal dependencies, and that allows your teams to then work in vertical slices. Definitely, like one of the things we've talked about is how hard some of these changes are to do, and this is one of the hardest challenges to get leaders to adapt to. But doing all these different things and bringing your architecture closer to the team and leaving those decisions as long as, as far out as you can, rather than making them all up front, really brings you into that agile mindset and ways of working. Yes, Sarah, Amy, anything to add to that? I feel like I rambled a little bit.
No, on the abilities, Michelle, the reason I asked about that is because a lot of times one practice or one thing I see teams doing is not having those end-to-end slices that include both the functional and the non-functional, we really need to be thinking about that as well. So I'll just kind of throw on to that, but that was the only add-on that I can think of. But
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michelle. So I have a question for you, Sarah. So as a senior agile coach here at EPAM, why is the DoD definition of done so important for both agility and engineering excellence?
Yes, that's another good question. So we have to make sure that the finish line is the same for everyone, right? A lot of times we go into various clients across the board and they have different definitions of done across teams, across programs. So a lot of times you'll see, maybe there's a QA definition of done, maybe there's a BA definition of done, or even dev done, right? And then there's real done, which means it's actually done, it's in production, it's gone through all the steps, right? And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that that finish line, and when we talk about done, means the same thing for everyone. And we want that to include product teams. We want that to include any other external team, across the program, right? So when someone says, this piece of work is done, they don't need to ask the question, well, which done is it? Or is it done, or is it done, right? So everyone knows there is only one true definition of done. And it holds everyone highly accountable to the same standard, right? General team alignment. And so we want to make sure that that definition of done is documented, because it also ensures technical excellence, right? We make sure that, have smoke tests been done? Is UAT done? Is all the acceptance criteria written well? Make sure that's been tested against, looked at, reviewed. All of those things that build good technical excellence are in that document, and it ensures it for every piece of work that is built within that program.
Yeah, and I think maybe we should I don't know if we did a definition of what a definition of done is. So it really includes everything that the organization has to do to deliver the product to customers. And so, it's really easy if you have one team, but it is harder when you have a larger organization, multiple teams under teams. When you start scaling, that definition done is so much more important, but it's so much harder to align and adhere to. So that's something like, it's nothing that we do here is with Agile and excellence is necessarily easy, but the value that you maintain from it or you get from it is just so important that you need to keep trying and keep trying. And I think one thing I know, when I help teams create a definition of done, we start out, it's never going to be perfect to start, it will never be perfect, right? But even as you start and you first create yours, maybe only have 3 to 4 things, right? And that's okay, because we're just starting it. And then every retrospective, you can review it, adapt it, and add to it. It might be that your practices, as you adapt CI/CD or automation, maybe they're manual and it's just not as easy to do some of it. So the definition of done will also change and evolve as you adopt more technical excellence. And so it's kind of like, it helps you see, oh God, this is awful. The fact I have to do this every time manually, that then just sparks an idea of, hey, let's automate. Or hey, there's a new tool out there, let's experiment with that, because that might make it easier to hit our definition of done. So.
And Michelle, you made a great point too. I think you said something, or maybe it was Sarah. One of you said something to the point that, your definition of done is what are all the things that you need to have in order to get something out to the customer. And so typically at first, right, especially if you're working in 2-week sprints, especially at large organizations that have a lot of dependencies, it's not possible to in 2 weeks deliver full end-to-end things, right? But to Michelle's point, you should keep adding to your definition of done as you put those automation practices in place that ultimately allow you to get customer value faster. So that in the end, your definition of done should be everything that that you need to do to get it actually out to the customer. But at the very beginning, that's usually not realistic. And so just making sure that, the teams aren't feeling that frustration, like, oh, this is never going to be possible, right? So we have to start somewhere, and it's an evolution, and it's a journey, and just having something is absolutely better than nothing, right? And there's so many good things about having a good definition of done, just that common understanding that the team saying every time I do something, I'm gonna live up to this quality standard. It just really helps to build trust as well.
Right. I think one thing I'll note that too that we actually build in our training is that a definition of done is not acceptance criteria. Like, I think teams can often confuse that, and they're definitely different. Like, their definition of done is as a whole for every PBI, product backlog implement, user story, defect, etc. You are going to adhere to this definition of done, where your acceptance criteria is by story, and so that's something to know there's a difference between those. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, Amy, and Michelle. Back to you, Amy. You are Director Agile Coaching here at EPAM. So what Agile metrics should we use to measure out technical agility?
A great question. And you just reminded me that I didn't introduce myself either. So Amy Ness, I'm part of the Agile consulting practice with Sarah and Michelle, and I've been at EPAM for over a year and a half now. So there's so many metrics that can be used to measure not just technical agility, but are we on track? Those progress metrics. There's metrics around business outcomes, business value, and all of those are really important. I'll just throw out a couple things that you can do to measure your technical practices or your technical agility. So one of those is mean time to recovery. So if the system goes down, on average, like how long would it take to bring it back up, right? Another one could be your code coverage, like how much of your code is covered by your automated tests, or what is your change failure rate? So again, you can really get ridiculous with metrics. And so you just need to make sure you're upfront about what are you going to be doing with those metrics? How are they helping you get better? Why is that something that you should measure? Things like that, because otherwise it's, you have there's so many metrics that you can have, and which ones really matter to the organization, and which ones do you think are going to resonate with your teams and your leaders? So
I think that's probably, oops, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I think it's important to know that, like Amy said, there's hundreds of metrics out there you can measure, that you're only picking the select few that are important to you, maybe even at that given time, right? So if defects are really high, maybe that's really where you want to focus those metrics at first. Yeah. But as you get better and you improve, that's not a metric you have to track for life, right? You can always change your metrics, reset them. Maybe it's once a quarter, every 6 months, whatever makes the most sense for you and your team and your situation. So don't think I picked this one metric today and I have to stick with it forever, right? Only use the metrics that are really serving the purpose you need them for, and don't feel like you need to measure them if you've already gotten to a successful level.
Yeah, and I also think, like, adding on to that, that's a great point. Like, counting defects, awesome for the team. They need that and it helps them. I think we need to be careful then as leaders to make sure that we're not then using those metrics in a negative way against the team, right? We want the teams to be able to track whatever makes sense to them to get better, inspect and adapt and move to that excellence, right? But as leaders then, we need to think about the measures that matter to us too in a different way, and looking at outcomes rather than outputs, looking at OKRs, objectives and key results, looking at the, aligning to the strategy of the organization, and so there's different levels of metrics. And I think it's really easy to get caught up in paying attention to those low level team metrics, and then basing, thought, decisions, strategy, et cetera, off of that. And that's not what we want to do in Agile, right? We want to let the team self-manage, empower them to fix those. If there's 400 defects, empower the team to come up with a way to get rid of the 400 defects, to have a zero quality or zero defect release, right? And so, and then as leaders, finding out the metrics that matter there, and like really what are you measuring? And I would say customer satisfaction is a business, that's a metric that really matters to the business. With high quality, your customer satisfaction is going to go up, but let the team figure those out and don't sit there and micromanage, like, we got to get that number from 400 to 399, now to 398, now 399. Like, there's no value in that for the team, and you're really just, you're going to lose team members and disengage them if you're paying too close attention to the team metrics.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sarah. So we have 7 minutes left. I can take 1 or 2 questions from our audience from the chat, but I'm not seeing any. And so please, you can write. My apology. I should have said, please put the question, submit your question in the chat, and then my panelists will be able to answer. But anyway, if we
I wonder,
don't have
Agnes,
the
one
chance,
topic. Oh, sorry, can we jump? One topic we didn't cover that I think is really important is around the feedback loops. Diving into those feedback loops a little bit more, because we've all said it: inspect and adapt, feedback loops, how important they are. But I think there's a lot of reasons it's so important for engineers, the Scrum team members, etc. Like, so maybe we could dive into that a little bit since we have 6 minutes left. So
go ahead, Michelle. Yes.
Okay, I can jump in. I'll start. So I think, like, for me, paired programming is always, I hate bringing it up because I was an engineer at one point. I did TDD, it was those XP practices, right? And some paired programming. And to me, it wasn't my favorite thing. And so I hate even bringing it up, but it really works for teams. Like, and so like the quality goes up, it's, and you get 2 sets of eyes on it immediately. And so it's a positive thing. I think the biggest issue with paired programming is finding a pair that works for you, right? And so
I was going to ask Michelle, what didn't you like about it?
I would go home and I'd come back and all of our code would be rewritten. So that's not a good example of a good pair. So yeah, there's rules you need to put in place, working agreements, etc. But man, the results are amazing when you get a well-functioning paired team. And so I think that's one way to get a quick feedback loop. Sarah, Amy, any other thoughts?
I don't have anything from my end. I think
like, so also thinking about like unit tests. That's another way to get a quick feedback loop, right? If you're always writing unit tests, you're going to get that feedback immediately. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be people feedback, right? It can be, your tests. If you're running regression tests and they're always running, if you're you're doing trunk-based development rather than branches, that's another way to get quick feedback, right? Like, so you at every hour or whatever, you're pushing your code into the trunk and you're running regression tests. You're going to get that feedback immediately on, hey, you just blew up everything, or yep, it's working. So those are some other ideas, I think.
I think your point of just not having to wait to the end of each sprint, right? That it can be much faster and doesn't necessarily even have to just be within Agile events, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be just in the daily stand-up that we're getting these feedback loops, but it's other ways that we're working to get that feedback.
Yeah, I think we talked about like code reviews, our automated tests give us that immediate feedback, right? But I love that, Sarah. It's not just at the daily stand-up or at the sprint review or at the retro. There's it can be hourly, daily, by the second, actually. So great points.
So any questions from the audience? We have 3 minutes. Okay. So let's wrap up this. So now we're coming to the conclusion of this event. So I would like to thank the organizer of the EngX Community Day, but I would like to thank my Agilists and panelists, Michelle, Amy, and Sarah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for all these brilliant presentations and answering my questions. So I also would like to thank members of the audience for attending and participating. I promise you still have the opportunity to submit your questions. I will follow up and make sure that you get answers from those questions. So you can still put questions in this chat, and then you will get those answers from my panelists. And then please remain online for the next event, just in case you still have time, because we have an important topic coming up. The topic is diversity is being invited to a party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So that's all I have today. Thank you for being there. Thank you for my panelists. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Agnes.
Thank
Thanks, everyone.
you.